첫 번째 강사는 박병진 조지아 주 하원이십니다. 2010년 2월 2010년에 조지아 주 하원 의원으로 선출이 되셨고요. 지금 현재 바우더스파라는 내셔널 러펌에서 리티게이션 파트너로 일을 하고 계시고 조지아 트렌드 아니면 각종 퍼블릭 잡지 같은 데서 특히 40 under 40 뭐 그런 식으로 젊은 프로페셔널 중에서 가장 영향력이 있는 조지아에서 손꼽히는 영향력이 있는 그런 영 프로페셔널 꼽히는 분이고 또 그 전국 아시안 변호사협회에서도 40 under 40 그래서 아주 영향력 있는 분으로 손꼽히는 인물이십니다. 오늘 바쁘신 중에도 저희한테 좀 귀중한 말씀 해주시느라고 시간을 빼주셔가지고 정말 감사드리겠습니다. 지금 이제 환영하는 의미에서 크게 박수 한번 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you. 감사합니다. So this is Saturday morning, so I try to make the presentation a little bit more interactive. First of all, thank you for participating in this program. This is second year that I came to speak, and I am a lawyer, so I want to start off with disclaimers. So first of all, I'm not a sociologist, and what I'm going to talk about today is something that I've gained through my own experiences in the professional service world, in addition the political world, and from my colleagues who are also Asian American and Korean Americans. Number two, I wanted to tell you that to a certain extent, you got to do as I say and not as I do. What I mean by that is there's some things that I try to do and I'm not very good at, and I'm going to talk about a couple areas. The theme of my topic is the model minority myth and what I think it takes us to break it, because all of us are professionals in business, and how do we overcome some of the stereotypes that we are. So what is the model minority myth? Any of you guys familiar with this concept? Okay. Model minority myth actually means that Asian Americans, Asians in general, are viewed as someone who works hard and always successful, and that they don't really need any help, or that they are progressing fine in American society. So there's a presumption that you do some things well. How many of you guys ever got a question like, oh, you guys are good at math, right? I mean, they presume that. Okay, I happen to be good at math, but and so a lot of things and a lot of weaknesses and a lot of cultural differences that puts Asian American professionals at a disadvantage gets kind of swept to the side in American culture. So that's the model minority myth, that you don't need any help and that you're actually perfect. But let's look at the statistics here. Asian Americans comprise about 5% of the US population, but we only comprise 0.3% of corporate officers. So when I give this talk, I always say, how many of you guys know brilliant people with PhDs and came out as Seoul Nationals, Seoul, and Kodae, whatever? Well, they're not at the top of the heap in the American society. How many of you guys know people like that? Right? And only 1% of board members, and these are corporate board members, and there's a lot of companies, ESOP, right? These are where the power brokering and business gets done. There's only 1% of Asian Americans. So you can imagine 1% of Korean Americans are out of that 1%. It's even significantly smaller. 2% of college presidents. That's only in recent years, and we had a couple presidents, including the president, I believe, Dartmouth, who happens to be Korean American. And then 1.5% of top 500 publicly traded companies is Asian American. Top 5%. So 1.5% is like, what is that, 5.5 maybe, 5-7 people? It used to be 9, then it dropped to 7. And you ask yourself, wait a second, we have lots of brilliant folks. If you look at the MBA programs and you look at the law schools, we have tons of Asian Americans coming out. And these numbers are reflected in every profession, including law firms. In my law firm, I have 550 lawyers in my law firm, and out of that, we have maybe 6 Asian American partners. Although if you look at the law school class, there's a lot of lawyers that are Asian American that join law firms, and we don't generally make it. It's even worse for women. in law school today, women comprise the majority of law students. And when they join the law firm or progress along, the top tier partnership, women are at a significantly low number, less than 20%. So what is causing this disparity? So I'm going to take a question. Anybody guess what's causing this disparity? Why do you think that, yes?
Take secure jobs.
Secure jobs, okay. Anybody else guesses? I'm going to argue a couple things, and I'll point a couple things out, I think. I would say that we have a cultural disadvantage in business, in American business. And you got to let me explain. That seems kind of controversial, but because in an organization, any companies or groups, you'll notice that there are dynamics and there's cultural things in play. When I mean by culture, I don't just necessarily mean Asian American background, but I'm talking about your experiences where you grew up, right? I'm going to focus on Asian Americans and a little bit about Korean Americans in general because in my experience and in my friends' experience, I see a distinct bias that we hold, right, that perpetuate the model minority myth, and at the same time, that we should pay attention to kind of overcome that disadvantage. Particularly, we want to focus on how do we react in that organization, because depending on the value system or dynamics of your company or your organization, your cultural background, how you fit in and how you reconcile that is going to be key in advancing. So every company is not the same, right? Every company has different cultures. I'll tell you, my law firm tends to be a little bit more decentralized, right? They're more like kumbaya, let's get along. There are other organizations who happen to be kind of straight up cutthroat. You eat what you kill. So how you react to that or how your cultural values fit into that overall value of the organization makes a big difference. But we can make some generalities. I'm going to start with this. How many of you guys read this book? Just one? And Malcolm Gladwell is actually a very good author, and he's one of the, probably the brilliant writers in our time. When I read this book, there was one example that he brought up that really struck a chord with me. And I'm going to bring this up. You guys remember this? Korean Air Flight 801? This is the plane that crashed into Guam. Remember? Back in '97, there was a huge, I think about 85–90% of the people died. And many folks, including people in aviation, have studied this crash. And I think when I tell you exactly why I'm bringing this up, it highlights some of the cultural bias that we have. So what happened in Korean Air Flight 801, everybody realizes that it was very foggy that day when the plane was coming into Guam. Visibility was zero. And those of you who have flown or who have pilots, and my brother-in-law is actually a pilot for a 767, you know that in a 747 like this, you generally have a captain and two co-captains, co-pilots. So there's 3 people in the cabin. So one person serves as the engineer, one is the first officer, and then there's the captain, right? The captain is generally the most senior person. In order for you to be captain of a large plane like 747, you have to be very senior. And so when you review kind of the radio traffic going back and forth in the cockpit to the air traffic control in Guam and amongst the pilots, it's very interesting. What highlights was they knew that with the visibility in the mountains in Guam, and if you guys ever flown into Guam, there's kind of the airport's kind of, you have to go through the middle of the mountain to go get down to the airport. If the visibility was zero, their sensors, they weren't reading the sensors correctly. And Malcolm Gladwell goes, painstakingly through this kind of process. What happened is the first officer and the engineer spotted the mistake. The captain actually, it turned out later he didn't get enough sleep the night before or whatnot, but the captain had heard that the first officer and the engineer had spotted that there was a potential mistake going in flight. So the way they communicated that was they waited and waited. And they didn't tell the captain that, wait, the captain, you're screwing up. They didn't say that. They waited and waited. And when it got very close to the mountain, when the engineer suggested, he said, Captain, perhaps we should pull up. Captain ignored it, kept going on. And then the first officer was getting very nervous. You could kind of tell what's going on. The first officer, again, instead of saying, pull up, suggested again to the captain, Captain, perhaps we should pull up a little bit more. This went on for a good 25 seconds. And the next thing you know, the plane runs into the mountain and crashes. And you wonder why this happens. Is because we are programmed into a hierarchical structure. We have Sambe and Huga, right? Especially Korean culture. And it's not like us when we grew up, and I grew up in a Korean family. You don't challenge people who are older than you in your seniority, right? Even when they're screwing up. By golly, if we're driving off a cliff, all of us are going to go, right? That's kind of the mentality that we have. We're programmed that way culturally. And this line in the book kind of surprised me some more. He said, Korean Air had more plane crashes than almost any other airline in the world for a period at the end of 1990s. It's not because the captains are less experienced flying. There's a lot of cultural discussions about why is that? Why is that? And one of the observations that Malcolm Gladwell and some of the experts came out to be was that because of this hierarchical structure, there was no questioning of authority, and hence, when there's human pilot error, there's less likely of a correction. And if you look at the last line I highlighted, it says, you are obliged to be deferential towards your elders and superiors in any way that would be unimaginable in the US. That line highlights the cultural difference in the professional world in any organization between Koreans, ethnically Koreans, or ethnically Asian even, versus how business is done in the US. Now, let me ask you this. When you guys are drinking last night, when you have a lot of older folks, and they say something stupid, who calls them out or asks any questions in that group? Right? You guys are a little bit more experienced, more Americanized, yet you still fall into that trap, right? And so, think about it the other way. People in the US and most decision makers in high powerful positions tend to be white males. Am I wrong about this? I'm not being racist, but that's actually a fact. I mean, that's why there's a big push in corporate world about diversity in view and ethnicity and background and culture, right? But the US culture, if you think about it, historically, this country was founded upon a revolt against authority. So if you look at it at a historical perspective, the way US does business is they assume that if something's wrong, you need to speak up. You would speak up, right? If you don't speak up, everything's fine. But if an Asian American in that context with a cultural background I just described, it's less likely that we're going to speak up because what? We're supposed to be very deferential to our bosses. So one of the rules I always talk to people, people ask me, you know, you seem like you've kind of navigated in a world where it's not predominantly Asian American. Yes, I'm the only Asian American elected to the state office in the state of Georgia. Now I'm the only one ever. There was one other one that was half Chinese. And you ask yourself, we have, over 200,000 Asian Americans in the state. And I'm the only one. And why is that? Because there's some things that I think that I recognize about myself that I had to overcome. And let me tell you a little personal story. When I first decided to run for office, and I live in a pretty white district, the first question in my mind was, would white people vote for me? Or would non-Asian people, would they be able to relate to me to be able to vote, right? And I asked myself, I worked in the professional world all my career, in government and in private sector, and I shocked myself saying that was the first question that came to my mind. So when I talked to my political consultant and said, well, what do you think? I mean, am I too Asian, or how do you think the demographics would react to me? It never really occurred to him. He's like, well, I think that's fine. But I realized there was a self-biased selection that I had about myself, because I grew up in a culture where, putting yourself out there wasn't, viewed as something that's encouraged. They put your head down and work very hard, right? But I recognize that in the professional world and political world, whichever organization that you go to, as we do business in the United States, as we do business around the world, we have to be sensitive about our cultural biases that we hold within ourselves. So number one rule that I recommend is speak up to move up. This is not something that comes very easily. You have to consciously make a decision to speak up. And I think it's even worse for women minorities. It's even tougher for Korean women and Asian women because you have the model minority myth and this perception that you're this lotus flower, that you're not supposed to speak up. You have to overcome that bias. Now, we see this in proverbs that you see all the time. You know, if the loudest duck gets shot, you ever heard that? That's a Chinese proverb, right? Then you have a nail that sticks out gets hammered. That's a Japanese proverb, right? And then the most recently, this terrible tragedy in the Seoul ferry disaster, when everybody knew on that boat, and high school kids, that the boat was capsizing and they followed direction and stayed on. Do you think if that happened in the US, you know how many high school kids would have just jumped out regardless of what the captain has said when you see the boat tipping? I don't think you would have seen that as many victims here. Because I think it's a cultural bias that we have in a hierarchical society that we can't question authority. Or it's difficult for us to question authority. But like I said, in the US, we're expected to do that. Now, the stand up and speak your mind thing, I use a kind of I guess a shallow example. And I put dramas over here. And I always laugh because when I watch Korean dramas, you see a lot of pumjagum, poses and things like that, and you have an hour show. It's about 40 minutes of kind of reflecting what happened in the past, and you're sitting there at a coffee shop, right? And there's not much communication going on except when it blows up, right? So people figure things out through situations and thinking about how that is. In the US, if you look at kind of the dynamics, even in popular culture, they directly say it, right? There's not this indirect kind of figuring out what do you mean or how do you feel. In the US, they just go out and ask you and you just tell them, right? And remember I told you about historically in the US, we were built upon a society and a value system that you need to speak out, right? The country was founded upon revolting. It is almost your civic duty to say something when you see something that's wrong, right? Now, I use this example right here. Now, I look at the last presidential election, and you look at the three candidates, and in Korea, politics is kind of interesting. Everybody acts very humble in public, right? Behind the scenes, they just rip each other apart, right? And I think the reason the president candidate, Ahn, was so popular was he was very humble. I think people knew that. And so he had this uprising of kind of support until he dropped out, of course. But I want to bring this up as an example of a cultural difference. You know, he's very, very successful as a software mogul, a politician. You know, he's very rich, professor. That's what we emulate in Korean culture, right? We want somebody to be humble and modest about their successes. In the U.S., not so much. We like humility, right? And we like modesty. But there's this other action. Anybody know who this person is? Floyd Mayweather, right? He's one of the greatest boxers probably ever lived. He is pompous, arrogant, and my gosh, when you talk about self-promotion and creating value for yourself, this guy's the champion, a true champion. But if you look at it in the drastic contrast of the culture of the US, it's accepted that if you are, in fact, the man, that you could tell people that you are, in fact, the man. Can you imagine if this Floyd Mayweather was a Korean guy and did that in Korea? Can you imagine? It would be an uproar, boycott, you know? And as a result, recognize that in any organization, particularly in the professional world, when most of your colleagues and your superiors are not Asian or may not share directly cultural values, that you have a disadvantage in the sense that you have a default program to not speak out. So you have to speak out. Now, I'll use an example of my good friend Neil Newman, who's a law professor at University of Texas Southern, I think. We started at the law firm together. Neil is a very, very smart guy. He's an African-American male, CPA, and a lawyer just like me. He started in the corporate group. I started in the litigation group. And we were friends because we played basketball together all the time. And then about 4 years into the law firm, he calls me, he says, I'm leaving. I said, why are you leaving? I thought you were doing great. He said, listen, here's the problem. I can't relate to the people who are giving me assignments. So we have this implicit bias that we want to be with people who are like us. That's not being prejudiced, just subconscious bias that we have. You go to any kind of networking function, I tend to do this. The first person, if I don't know anybody there, I go straight to an Asian person. Or you see a Korean person, you go straight to somebody that looks Korean, right? It's a bias that we have because we share something together. So he said, look, what happened is after a while, all the prime assignments, all the exciting deals that lawyers get to work on, they weren't coming to him despite the fact that he was just as good as everybody. Because the people handing out the assignments implicitly had this bias, going to somebody that they knew a little better, white person, black person, whatever it was. But for him, he worked in a corporate group and he was the only African-American associate, right? So after a while, the exciting deals that get you excited about working hard goes to other people. You end up with the routine stuff. What happens is when you're not challenged in an organization, you feel discontent, your work quality suffers, you get discouraged, demoralized, then you decide to leave. And that's one of the real big reasons why you can't have, that's why there's a disparity among the top ranks in law firms. And it's true for accounting firms too. And so the reason being is he had this bias, he had to have this bias to overcome, right? And his bosses did a terrible job. They had a bias, and they might have recognized that. They have an implicit bias of going somebody to look like them. So it's the same thing for Asian American. So the reason I say you have to speak up is, hey, if you don't go and ask for that big deal, plump projects, it's very hard to overcome that because we are programmed to work very hard. We study hard, do great, and then you'll get to top schools and somebody will recognize you and move up. But is that always the case? If you don't challenge yourself, if you're not willing to overcome that bias by telling the boss that I want the hardest thing that you have because I want to prove myself, right? If you don't do that, there's no chance to move up. That's why I say you got to speak out. No chance to move up. Second reason, rule 2, aim high and take risks. And I know it's Saturday morning, so I try to do this. I hope this works. You guys, I don't know if you guys ever remember this ad from the Super Bowl about 5 years ago. Let me see if it works here. Oh, by the way, I didn't know if we had Wi-Fi, so I actually took this on my phone. Okay.
I need you.
Is that playing?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that went out the window. It's actually a commercial. So I knew that we might run into this technical difficulty. So basically, this ad is a bunch of little kids talking about, when I grow up, I want to be this, I want to be that, right? It's about dreams. But instead of saying, I want to be the president of the company, I want to be this and that, actually what they say is, I want to grow up, when I grow up, I want to file all day. And another child goes, I want to climb my way up to middle management. The third person says, I want to be, when I grow up, I want to be able to be replaced on a whim. So it's kind of funny, right? Because nobody aims for those things, but that's kind of what happens. And so the question then becomes, culturally what I see is, when we're young, we have all this dreams and aspirations. And I want to start with this right here. Are we aiming high enough? There's actually, I read an article in the New Yorker about a Vietnamese American guy who goes out to the Silicon Valley, and he helps other Asian American males to pick up women. And he offers this for like $2,500 services, right? It's very amazing. And then you ask yourself, and I said, I put Beauty and the Beast syndrome in here because when I grew up in the 80s and I used to see like really ugly people with beautiful, beautiful women. So how in the world how did that happen? It's probably because, you know, the average folks like us, well, many of us, many of guys, I guess, sorry, HP, you know, we're like, hey, you know, if I can't ask a supermodel out because they're going to reject me, right? So the supermodels usually complain nobody asks me out, except for the people who don't give a crap, you know, the folks who are ugly, they just go up there and ask, and that's how I end up. And that's actually very true, Beauty and the Beast syndrome. So I use that as an example. I mean, are we aiming high enough, right? We self-limit ourselves saying, well, this is how much I could achieve. You know, some people say, culturally we say if you aim too high, we have a cultural very, you know, what do we say? Well, Korean people say, oh, chugapsa, right? Right? We self-limit, and culturally we self-limit ourselves from dreaming higher. Then the question is, you know, look at the second generation. I asked my daughter, who happens to be, you know, 7 and 6, they're born in the United States. You know, when I was growing up, I never imagined that I would be a politician, let alone when I was their age, I never even dreamed that I would be anything. You know, I wanted to be an optometrist. That's what I wanted to be, right? You ask my kids, second generation, because culturally we speak English to them, they grew up in the United States. I asked them, what do they want to be? They want to be, they said, I want to be president and a ballerina. And, you know, and my other child, Maddie, she goes, well, I want to be, you know, I want to be a firefighter and an architect, which is kind of a weird combination. They're free of the cultural reinforcement that we put on them about what they could achieve, right? So you got to be mindful of, are you limiting yourself too much? Now, I find a lot of people do that, because until you ask for it or aim for that, you know, you never know you're going to get it. And I use this example all the time. If you are a state senator and you lost 2 times running for Congress, right? Would you ever think that in 6 years you would be president of the United States? You would never think that, right? Well, we have a president that went through exactly that path. Now, we could debate whether or not we think he's a good one, but fact of the matter is, he's there. He aimed very high, and he achieved it. He could have been a congressman and stayed there forever, but he aimed higher. So, the next thing I want to talk about is risk and reward. Culturally, I think that this proverb, I found this proverb to be very, very fascinating, a Korean proverb, right? It says, a turtle travels only when it sticks his neck out. What a great proverb. It says, you know, you have to take risks, right, to get anywhere. But culturally, is that true? Do we live by that? I think some people do. I think some people do. I think if you look, Asians generally tend to be more risk tolerant than others. That's why when you go to a casino, you see so many Asian Americans. Am I right? But I think it's very true that risk and opportunity, they reside in the same place. Meaning that if you don't risk something or take risks, that generally means that there's not many opportunities, and you give up a lot of opportunities. We may be, you know, risk tolerant culturally, but when in our lives in our professional world in the U.S., I find that Asian Americans tend to be very conservative. They're risk averse. And I can't really figure out why, but I only know a few people who are willing to risk it all for success. But if you think about the people who really achieve great things, like Bill Gates, right? He risked it all, gave up a Harvard education, and then started his business. Mark Zuckerberg, same thing, right? But how many Asian Americans do you see that risk all of it by throwing what we believe to be traditional route to success, education, hard work, right? So culturally, I think we have this kind of bias about not believing in ourselves to achieve great things. And I think there's a great disparity on how we view as failure versus how Americans or U.S. view failure. Now bring up like 2 things. I read an article when I was in Korea about the Mapo Bridge that's #1 for suicides, right? And it's not just Korean culture that have high suicide. In Japan even have very high suicide. per capita a lot higher than people in the U.S. or people in anywhere else. And we have to ask yourself why, because I think we put so much stock in how we define success. We set it up and we work so hard that even the slight miscalculation or the inability to reach that success, there's a great shame in it. We are so hard on ourselves about, trying and then failing. We're so afraid. And I have Korean clients, and I'm a litigator, so my job is to manage risk for them. There's a lot of unknowns. Look, if you do this way, that way, this is a possibility, that possibility. And the interesting thing is, everybody passes the buck on the decision. It's so funny. In the U.S. companies, when I tell the in-house lawyer, they say, well, here's the risk. What do you think? Here's what I recommend you doing. And they think about it, they go, all right, let's do it. In Korea, in Korean companies, I tell them the same thing. What happens is, oh, okay, let us think about it. So he or she runs it up the chain, then runs it up some more until the CEO or chairman of the board have to make a decision on what to do. And I say that because they're afraid that something goes bad, it's going to land on their lap, right? And in the U.S., and if I go play golf, a lot of Koreans and Korean Americans, man, they take a lot of mulligans, meaning, they hit a terrible shot and they shoot again, and they're willing to do that, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, really. But in real life, they're very hard on themselves. There's great shame on their family or whatnot if something fails. In the U.S., it's built in our DNA. And the reason I say that, if you know, those are guys who are constitutional scholars, there's actually a constitutional right to declare bankruptcy in the U.S. Meaning, the founding of this country, they expected you to fail to get a clean start, another mulligan, right? It's not like that in Asian countries. So they're a little bit more risk tolerant in the U.S. And I don't know if you see this cartoon or not. It's one of my favorite cartoons, Dilbert. So there's a U.S. saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs, right? Right here. And Dilbert goes, do you mean that I should upgrade the net and despite that there's a big risk that he may crash? He goes, no, I'm saying I'll break your eggs if the network goes down, as long as you do it. I think that's more Korean culture than American. And number three, and this is something that I reiterate, and you may know this, and a lot of people ask me, since I'm a politician, right, what are some of the tips about things? Sometimes it's who you know, and that's a hard fact, right? And there's an article written by this Korean-American guy named Wesley Yang. It's called Paper Tigers. I don't know if y'all ever read it. It's a beautiful piece. It's very long. It's a very, very good piece. But he had this comment in there I thought was very, very interesting. He said, it's part of the bitter undercurrent of Asian American life that meritocracy comes to an abrupt end after graduation. What that means is you could get the highest scores and all in grades and things like that until you graduate and you go into the professional world, then you realize that there's another rule and there's another kind of set of code that you got to learn to succeed in life. And what he said about undercurrent is those Asian Americans who figure that out tend to do fine. Those who don't figure that out or have a hard time transitioning, they get stuck in middle management. And so one of the things that I think Asian professionals that I see a lot, younger ones that are coming up, they have a hard time learning how to network, especially if they're a recent immigrant from Korea. They have a hard time networking. This is something I learned I thought was very interesting. When you think about the word network, there's the word work in there. It's work. It's who you know, right? And the toughest thing, I think, and something that I have to overcome as a politician is this. Learn how to talk to people outside your comfort zone. How do you guys talk to people on an airplane right next to you on the way up here? Anybody? A few people, right? Right? People who network very well always find commonalities amongst whoever they meet. And the number one thing that they do very well is listen. They ask a question and they listen. Because a lot of people most people like to talk about themselves or what they do. But you learn a lot, right? Master networkers learn how to talk to people outside your comfort zone. And if you go to like a networking reception and whatnot, you see a lot of people, the ones that network very well, they know how to work the room. They come back with like 50 cards, right? And we'll talk about follow-up in a second. And rest of us, you know, I'm not a great networker. Rest of us go in and, oh, there's somebody I know. I go and talk to them. You know, maybe somebody comes over, you know, then you have that awkward moment, like the new person comes in, like, should we let them in or whatnot. But it's a skill that I think you can learn. And you know, and I'll give you just a small example. I had to learn how to relate to people, just random strangers, when I went to their door to ask for them to vote for me, and whether or not I could put a yard sign, my name yard sign in their yard, right? And the consultants tell you each house you go to, you need to spend no more than 2 minutes. So you have to build a rapport within 2 minutes, ask for them to vote for you, and ask for them to put a yard sign. And a lot of times I was able to get people saying, hey, I want to help you out. Let me come volunteer for you in 2 minutes, right? So you have to, and I was terrible at it, trust me. When I first started, it was like, hi, I'm BJ Pack. I'm running for State House. Yeah. But by the time like a month and a half went on, I was an expert. Because I would walk up to the house, and one of the things I would do, I would notice a couple things. The yard is beautiful, or they would have like little things like, they went to University of Georgia, they would have a Georgia Bulldog or something down there. I go up there and say, oh, I see you have a Bulldog, did you go to Georgia? They're like, oh yeah, no, my son goes there, blah, blah, blah. Oh yeah, you watched that game last night, blah, blah, blah. We don't talk about politics at all. After 2 minutes, I'm like, hey, by the way, I'm running for State House, can I count on your vote? They're like, hey, I like you, yeah, you can count on my vote. Hey, can I put a yard sign down? I promise I'll pick it up after the campaign's over. Yeah, go right ahead, go right ahead. Boom. Each sign worth about 4 votes. And so, you know, you can get better at it by talking and finding out things that are common with folks. And I would say that's a mission for you. Just try it. I think it's very interesting. Just strike up a conversation with just a stranger and try to keep it going for 2 minutes. Now, not everybody's going to respond well. But I've seen plenty of doors slammed in my face, and people, you know, knocking on the door and, you know, cocking their shotgun. Who's there? Well, that happens. Trust me. No, I'm not kidding. It happens. It happens. So, ability to kind of pick out how you could interface with that person is a key in networking. And on top of that, the same thing in the business world. You have to have a plan, you have to be methodical, you have to be intentional, but sincere, right? When you make that contact with your boss or someone who has that project that you want to work on, or someone who could influence your career or have decisions, you want to have sincere relationships. You should think about how you're going to do that and be intentional about it. But don't be fake. I mean, I get a lot of people, hey, I met you, let's send in my LinkedIn invite, right? That happens all the time. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I usually accept everybody's LinkedIn invite. So please send me a LinkedIn invite, I'll accept it. And one of the tricks that I do, and I don't know, I may be preaching to the choir here, is this. I try to make mental notes when I meet people about a couple things about them. Like I went to a networking function yesterday, I met a couple people from DuPont, the chemical company, and I would talk to them. I generally want to know where they went to school. So, you know, my general question is, hey, are you from this area? And they usually tell, no, I actually grew up in Miami. Then I say, hey, I'm from Orlando. Really? Yeah. And you start talking to them. I know that they went to Florida State, right? And they happen to be a big FSU football fan. 2 things. So when I get their card, I will write a little note on there, FSU, Miami, grew up in Miami. And so when I put it in my Outlook contacts and you want to kind of refresh that, and I try to do it once a week, you should have, and when you do a follow-up email, instead of an email, try to do a handwritten note, like thank you for blah, blah, blah. That makes an impression, especially people that you want to have good relationships with. And you want to take time not to ask for business right away or ask for favor right away. You want to try to build that relationship to about, 4, 5, 6 interactions that are good before you ask a favor. Generally, you should look for how I could help them, right? People who are higher than you in terms of their careers, there's more that they could do for you than you could do for them, right? So you have to be careful about when you make the ask, but at the same time, when you meet people who are your contemporaries or whatnot, you should always think about how I could help them. And what I found out, especially in the political world, my friends who've helped me when I ran, they may be interested in becoming judges and things like that. I now serve on the judicial nominating committee of the governor, so I tend to have a great influence on who become judges. So my friends who want to become judges, I could help them because they help me, right? And that's just not in politics, and I found out this is in business as well. And so if I'm a lawyer, if I refer a case to another lawyer, they remember that. The next time they have a case to refer, they refer it to me. And same thing for in business and anything you guys in the trading, you want to learn about trading, that's exactly what it is. You know, you want to help out in this transaction, the next transaction, you keep in your mind inventory of those who you could help and they could help you. So this is an interesting cartoon. It says, I'm looking for a mentor who can show me how to get rich without boring me with a lot of advice, right? There's no such thing as that, but I find that, you know, being a mentor and finding a mentor is very, very important in overcoming some of our implicit biases that we have. When I joined the law firm, a large law firm here in Atlanta, there was no Asian American partners in the law firm, and so I didn't have like this you know, Hyundai Hubei type of thing. So I had to actually go find mentors. And it took me a little while because you want to gravitate towards someone who's, man, I wish I had another Korean American lawyer who's a partner over there. But it just didn't exist. So what's interesting, I just sought out several mentors and I was fortunate enough to get their help. And now I'm in a position that when a young lawyer asks me for some help or advice, I'm able to give it. And so that's kind of how we overcome some of our bias and you know, move up. I think if you think about kind of our relationships with our in South Korea, what I find is that relationship between somebody who is so deep, it's almost ingrained that you're supposed to help people who come after you. So we kind of take it for granted, right? You take it for granted, and you may not think so, but I think it happens. And what happens is, in the U.S., and I found this out, just because that person is Korean American and is older, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to help you, right? Or if there's an in-house lawyer who could send me business, hey, hopefully he'll send me some business, doesn't mean that's going to happen. Just because of the fact that we're both Korean, we actually have to be good at it. In politics, you know, I have several mentors. There's a lot of things, and it's true for business and any organization. There are a lot of unwritten rules, and a lot of decorum, things that you have to learn to make sure you navigate through the politics, in the organizational politics correctly. And so, for example, you know, in politics, they'll be telling you, don't piss that guy off because he'll kill your bill. Those types of things you need to learn, right? You don't want to cross this person, so you got to choose your battles correctly. Only mentors could tell you those things. Because you know, in any organization, figuring out the culture, nobody gives you a manual. You get an employee handbook, but they don't tell you, here are the personalities that you have to deal with, right? So you need people to kind of guide you through that. This is, I think, very, very important. Mentors, they tell you about opportunities before they're posted, right? And this is true for the professional world. I mean, I know about openings, but the problem is, if you don't speak up, think that you're interested in that position, they will never know what to think of you, right? That's why you got to tell them, and we got to get over that. Maybe they'll think of me. No, you have to tell them what you want, what you desire, so that they can say, hey, I know Peace, he's a really good guy, he's smart, he'd be perfect for this position. They'll call you and say, hey, listen, there's an opening coming up in my department. Would you be interested in come joining? Of course, because you told me that you were interested, things like that. So those things don't come naturally to Asian Americans, I think. In Korean culture, when we deal with only Koreans, I think we do it fine. But when we start mixing cultures, we don't do it as well. So that's a bias that we have. And to tie it all up, I'll give you rule number 4. Remember the Jordan rule. Those who are basketball fans, Michael Jordan, he had this quote in here I thought was very apropos. He said, he missed more than 9,000 shots in my career, probably the greatest basketball player ever, right? It says, I've lost almost 300 games, and he said, I've taken he takes more than 26 game-winning shots. He said, I took 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot, and I missed. And I don't know how many, successful shots. I think it's a whole bunch of them, right? Probably not as many as 26, but we remember those great shots. It said, I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that's why I succeed. Meaning, man, failing a little bit doesn't get him, discouraged, and he keeps going. And remember, culturally, we're programmed to be really hard on ourselves when we fail or we don't do well in certain things. And it's even worse, like for example, if you're not good in math, and when you talk about the model minority myth, thinking that you are going to be great in math, it's double the impact. And so I adopted this kind of quote and came up with a new rule, the Asian American Jordan rule, the Jeremy Lin version. Those of you who know Jeremy Lin, right? The guy's a very good basketball player, but he was never recruited to a Division I school on a scholarship. The reason I say that is because I think if you watch him play now and you see it, I think that NBA scouts and college scouts, who do not happen to be Asian, they don't view him as a basketball player. Am I right? So he had to do it the hard way. And I said, look, we're an ethnic minority in a non-Asian society. So we have to actually work twice as hard to get the same things. And that's the Jeremy Lin rule. And he'll say that if you think about it. And that's very unfair, but I think that's very true. Until we have enough mass out there in quantities to kind of change the perception of the model minority myth, we actually have to work doubly hard. And second, we have to accept failure as a necessity and step toward success. And I put door to door in here because there were days when I would just get series of people slamming the door on me and saying they're not going to vote for me, blah, blah. And it gets very discouraging after a while. And I use that example because I think it's a concrete example instead of something like in my professional career. But I tell you, at the end of the day, you'll run into that one house or one voter who will say things like, I'm so appreciative that you offer yourself up for service. I know that it's not easy, right? I think you're sincere. I'm going to vote for you. I'm going to tell all my friends to vote for you because I think your heart's in the right place. Man, that makes it all better. It's unbelievable. You would have a rough day, like on a Saturday like this. You start at 9 o'clock and you're sweating, getting bitten up by mosquitoes. And about 8:55, you run to the last house and somebody says, I believe in you. I'm going to vote for you. And even some people write you a check to support your campaign. It makes it all worthwhile, right? So don't focus on so many of the failures and our inadequacies and the unfairness of the rule that's against us. You've got to focus on the successes and that you are on the right path and believe in yourself to do it. And so, last thing is, sometimes Asians, we don't like to ask for help, for assistance. Other people, some people are just like really good at it. I mean, they'll ask all kinds of things. I have a friend who barely met my sister who works for Delta, asked for a buddy pass. I don't even know who that person is. I'm like, hey, can I have a buddy pass? So my sister's like, who is this guy? I'm like, so did you give it to him? Well, yeah, but my point is we don't like to bother folks because we're just programmed to be very private, right? When's the last time you guys went to talk to your next door neighbor? It's just culturally we're just programmed that way, right? Americans are a little bit more gregarious. They'll come over with a basket of cookies and say, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. That's a cultural difference. And so we need to overcome that. So when we need help, we need to learn and deprogram ourselves to ask for it. We don't want to show, we're so proud that we don't want to show that we don't know something or we're not going to do well. We forget to ask. And so what happens is we screw up big. And that's what happened with Korean Airline, right? The airplane. And so those are some general rules that I found myself in my political and my professional world, that culturally, that we are in fact different. And we could do everything that we want in American society, but without recognizing these challenges that we have as a culture, that we're not going to have the same successes as the others. And I hope that going forward, that you keep these things in mind, and I hope to see you on the corporate boards. I hope to see you running these companies and I hope to see one of Korean Americans to be president or the U.S. senator in this country. And I'd be happy to answer any question. Thank you so much.